For 20 years, the same chair faced the same window, looking out over the gray water of Lake Michigan. And for 20 years, the man sitting in it had stopped expecting the view to change. His name was Daniel Hayes, and there had been a time, long ago, when people said his name the way people say the names of men who are going somewhere. Now they said it the way people speak of a building or a fortune or a ghost. The rain came down that October evening exactly the way it had the night everything changed, and Daniel watched it streak the glass without really seeing it, because after enough years, even rain stops feeling like weather and starts feeling like a memory repeating itself. He had been 24 when it happened. Before that night, Daniel had been a young man who believed the world owed him very little and that he would take the rest for himself through work. He had served 2 tours overseas as an Army Ranger, came home with a Purple Heart he rarely mentioned, and within 3 years had turned his father's small trucking company into something the local papers called a phenomenon. He had a fiancée named Claire, a future mapped out in his head down to the year, and a father who used to grip his shoulder and remind him that there was nothing in this world a man couldn't move if he put his back into it. Then, on a wet Tuesday night, a delivery truck ran a red light at 60 miles an hour and turned Daniel's car into scrap metal and his spine into something the doctors at Chicago Memorial described, very gently, as catastrophic. He woke up 3 weeks later, and the first thing he noticed was not pain, it was silence. A silence that lived in his legs, a silence that never went away no matter how many specialists examined him, no matter how many surgeries they tried, no matter how many therapists came and went over the years that followed. Doctors used the word permanent. Specialists used the word irreversible. Claire left 2 years after the accident, not cruelly, but the way water leaves a cracked glass, slowly, and then all at once. Friends stopped calling. Family dinners became occasions where everyone tried very hard not to look at the wheelchair, which somehow made it the only thing anyone could see. By the time Daniel turned 44, he was one of the wealthiest men in the state of Illinois, with companies bearing his name on buildings he had never personally walked into. And every night he ate dinner alone in a lake house with 11 empty bedrooms at a table built for 12. Money, it turned out, could buy almost anything except the one thing Daniel actually wanted, which was simply to stand up. 30 miles south, in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, a woman named Grace Bennett was fighting a very different war, one that started before sunrise every single day. The first thing Grace did each morning was check the small breathing machine beside her son's bed, listening for the rhythm of it, because some mornings that rhythm was the only thing standing between an ordinary day and an emergency room. Her son's name was Eli. He was 8 years old, and he had been born with a rare lung condition that required a strict and devastatingly expensive combination of medications just to let him breathe like other children. Eli was, despite everything, a remarkably bright and stubborn little boy. He spent most evenings at the kitchen table with a box of colored pencils, drawing the same picture over and over, a soldier standing on top of a hill, arms raised with the sun behind him. When Grace once asked why he always drew the same soldier, Eli told her with the total seriousness only children can manage that the soldier was the one who hadn't given up, even after everyone told him he couldn't keep going. Grace had smiled at that and said nothing, but she had kept one of those drawings folded in her wallet ever since. Grace worked full-time as a physical therapist at a community clinic, and she was good at her job. Gifted even, the kind other staff quietly sent their hardest cases to. But between rent, insurance premiums, co-pays, and the medications insurance refused to fully cover, Grace had spent the last 2 years choosing, every month, which bill would wait. One evening, after Eli had fallen asleep on the couch, with his oxygen line still taped beneath his nose, Grace opened the mailbox downstairs and found 3 envelopes that she already knew, before opening them, would not contain good news. Final notice. Past due. Eviction warning.
She sat there for a long time, the envelopes in her lap, and for the first time in 8 years of fighting for her son, Grace did not know what to do next. The next morning, a black car Grace did not recognize pulled up outside the clinic, and a man in a gray suit stepped out and asked for her by name. He introduced himself as Thomas Lane, and he explained, calmly, that Mr. Daniel Hayes had heard of her work with spinal injury patients and would like her to consider taking him on. Grace let out a short, tired laugh, reminding Thomas that every specialist in the country had already failed with a man like that. Thomas simply nodded and told her that he knew exactly that, and that this was rather the point, that she would be the last call Mr. Hayes intended to make. He added, almost as an afterthought, that Mr. Hayes had recently agreed to try a new spinal stimulation procedure his doctors had cautiously recommended, something that on its own had shown only modest results in other patients, but that their medical team believed might respond differently if paired with intensive, sustained physical therapy, something none of his previous therapists had stayed long enough to provide. Grace, hearing that, found herself agreeing before she'd fully decided to. 3 days later, she found herself standing in the entrance hall of the largest private home she had ever set foot in, expecting arrogance, and instead finding a house so large it echoed, and a man sitting near a fireplace in a room with no other lights on, staring into the flames as though they owed him an answer. He asked, without turning his head, whether she was another miracle worker. Grace set down her bag and answered plainly that she was not, that she was a physical therapist, that she didn't perform miracles, that most days her job was nothing more.
Dramatic than showing up and doing the work, procedure or no procedure. For a moment, something shifted in Daniel's face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. The work that followed was nothing like the movies make recovery look. There were Tuesdays and Thursdays and sometimes Saturdays, hour after hour of slow, grinding effort against 20 years of scar tissue, muscles that had forgotten what they were for, and a stimulation device that, for the first several weeks, produced nothing but mild discomfort and no visible change at all. 3 months in, Daniel reached a point he later described as the lowest of the entire process. After a session that left him in pain and showed by every measurable standard no progress, he told Grace flatly that he was done, that he had wasted enough years chasing impossible things, and he wasn't going to waste what was left of his life chasing one more. Grace didn't argue with him right away. Instead, she sat down across from him and told him something she had never told anyone at the lake house before. She told him that Eli's father, her husband, had also been a soldier, that he had come home from his second deployment and 18 months later had been killed in a training accident, leaving her alone with a newborn who was already struggling to breathe on his own. She told Daniel that for the first year after that, she hadn't believed she or Eli would make it either, and that the only thing that had gotten her through it was the simple, stubborn decision to show up the next day and the day after that, even when nothing seemed to be working. She told him she wasn't asking him to believe in miracles, she was asking him to show up on Thursday. Daniel didn't answer for a long moment. Then he asked quietly if Thursday still worked for her. It did. 5 weeks later, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, with rain once again streaking the windows, Grace was working through a routine stretch on Daniel's right foot when she felt something she had not felt in any of their sessions before. A small, almost imperceptible movement, a twitch barely there in his big toe. Grace froze. Daniel slowly lifted his head and looked down at his own foot. Neither of them spoke. Grace repeated the stretch, gently, and the toe moved again, small, weak, but undeniably real. For 20 years, Daniel Hayes had been told by every voice that mattered that this was impossible, and impossible had just moved half an inch.
He did not shout, he did not laugh, he simply sat there, and tears began rolling silently down his face, the kind of tears that come not from sadness or even joy exactly, but from the sudden, overwhelming weight of a door that had been locked for 2 decades, quietly clicking open. After that day, something between Daniel and Grace shifted permanently, though neither of them announced it. One evening, while waiting for Grace to finish a session, Thomas Lane mentioned, almost in passing, why she sometimes arrived late on Thursdays, a hospital appointment for Eli, a recurring issue with his medication coverage, a mounting stack of bills she
Never spoke about. Around the same time, Daniel's older sister, Margaret, who managed several of his investment accounts and visited the lake house perhaps twice a year, happened to be present for one of these conversations. Margaret had never liked the idea of a stranger having this much access to her brother, and she said so plainly, suggesting that a woman in Grace's financial position might have more reasons than therapy to keep coming back, and that Daniel, of all people, ought to know better than to let his guard down with someone who clearly needed his money. Daniel listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he told his sister, calmly but without softness, that Grace had never once asked him for anything in 6 months, had argued with him about quitting more than she had ever flattered him, and that if Margaret wanted to talk about people who only showed up when they thought there was something to gain, she might start by counting how many holidays she herself had missed at this house since the accident. Margaret left shortly after, and the subject never came up between them again. That night, Daniel sat for a long time in his study, looking out at the same dark lake he had looked at for 20 years, thinking about how he had spent 2 decades mourning his own life, while 30 miles away, a woman had been quietly fighting to save someone else's every single day, without ever once mentioning it to him. For the first time since the accident, Daniel found that someone else's pain felt larger than his own. The following week, instead of sending Thomas to handle it, Daniel asked to be driven to the hospital himself. He arrived in his wheelchair, a blanket over his legs, carrying a small paper bag. Grace, startled to see him there, asked what he was doing. Daniel told her he wanted to meet Eli, if that was all right. Inside the room, Eli looked up from his tablet, more curious than shy, and Daniel reached into the bag and pulled out a small die-cast model of an old delivery truck, the same model, it turned out, that his father's company had once run by the hundreds. He told Eli that when he was about Eli's age, his own father had given him one just like it, and that it had taken him years to understand that the truck wasn't really the point. The point was that someone had thought of him. Eli turned the little truck over in his hands, then asked Daniel, without any hesitation, whether he was the soldier from his drawings. Daniel, caught off guard, asked what he meant. Eli simply shrugged and said that his mom had a drawing of a soldier who didn't give up even when everyone said he should, and that Daniel kind of looked like that a little. Daniel didn't answer for a moment. Then he told Eli that he hoped one day to be exactly that. Before he left, quietly and without telling either of them at the time, Daniel arranged for every outstanding medical bill on Eli's account to be cleared, not just the current balance, but everything going back over a year, along with coverage for the next 12 months of treatment. Grace found out 2 days later when the hospital called to confirm the account was settled. She drove straight to the lake house, and when she found Daniel by the fireplace, she told him it was too much, that she couldn't possibly accept it. Daniel, without looking away from the fire, answered quietly that she had given him a toe that moved and a reason to keep showing up on Thursdays, and that he suspected they were still very much in her debt.
When Grace pressed again, his voice cracked slightly, and he admitted that he had spent 20 years feeling sorry for himself in a house bigger than most apartment buildings, while 30 miles away, she had been getting up before dawn to keep her son breathing and had never once complained. He said that meeting Eli and hearing him talk about a soldier who didn't give up had made something in him shift in a way he didn't fully know how to put into words. Months passed, and the sessions continued, and slowly, almost unbelievably, Daniel progressed from the smallest movements to standing with support, and from standing to the careful, trembling beginnings of steps with a walker. Then, on a cold evening in early spring, everything threatened to fall apart at once. Eli's condition, stable for months, suddenly worsened without warning. Grace arrived at the hospital to find her son already being rushed into the intensive care unit, machines humming, nurses moving with the brisk urgency that terrifies parents more than any amount of shouting ever could. Grace sat alone in the hallway outside the ICU doors, her hands pressed together so tightly her knuckles had gone white, feeling for the first time in 8 years completely powerless. Then, somewhere down the long hallway, she heard slow, uneven footsteps, the soft scrape of a walker against tile. Grace looked up, and there, moving toward her with painstaking effort, was Daniel Hayes. Not in a wheelchair, on his feet, walking. It took him nearly 2 full minutes to cross a distance that would have taken anyone else 15 seconds, but he did not stop, and when he finally reached her, he lowered himself slowly into the chair beside her, breathing hard. Grace, through tears she could no longer hold back, whispered that this must be it, that this was what all of it had been for. Daniel shook his head gently and told her that this wasn't why he had learned to walk. He explained, his voice breaking slightly, that he had learned to walk because she had shown him every single Thursday that giving up is a decision and not a sentence, and that her son, with one small drawing and one smaller sentence, had reminded him what it actually meant to keep going. He hadn't been about to let her sit in that hallway alone. By morning, Eli's condition had stabilized, and within a week, doctors reported that the treatment appeared to be working better than anyone had dared hope. 6 months later, Daniel stood backstage at a charity gala for children with chronic illnesses, leaning lightly on a cane now, his recovery still ongoing but undeniable. He had agreed to speak only because Grace had quietly told him it might help other families the way help had once found her. When he walked out onto the stage on his own, the applause was overwhelming because by then, parts of his story had reached the news. Many in that audience knew that Daniel Hayes, told for 20
years he would never walk again, was now standing in front of them. Almost none knew the real reason why. Daniel found Grace and Eli in the front row, Eli sitting up tall in a small suit, grinning the way only an 8-year-old at a party can grin. Daniel told the room that people kept saying Grace Bennett had taught him to walk again, and that in a way that was true, but it wasn't the whole story. What she had actually taught him, he said, was how to hope again, after 20 years of telling himself hope was a waste of time. And the boy in the front row, he added, had drawn a picture of a soldier who refused to give up long before he ever met the man, and had simply, without knowing it, been describing him back into existence. By the time Daniel stepped back from the microphone, there was hardly a dry eye in the room, including, for the first time in front of strangers, his own. If this story moved you even a little, that's exactly why we tell stories like this here on the Kind Souls Stories. Stories about quiet courage, second chances, and the kindness that changes everything. If you believe people like Daniel and Grace exist all around us, hit subscribe and join our family of kind souls. And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder today that hope is never truly gone. It just sometimes needs someone else to help us find it again.